Hi, I'm Art Kaplan. I'm at the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York City. Well, as many of you know, there are frequently calls for more and more sharing of data in many realms of biomedical research, social science, genetics. Uh, there are all kinds of calls for data sets that already exist to be shared. There are all kinds of calls for ongoing research to wind up sharing more data. Typical of this is the NIH. It's had a commitment recently to making the research it funds available to anyone in the public. They have a variety of sharing policies that they've instituted, trying to increase transparency and the availability of scientific data to other researchers and tools as well. So NIH says that it expects appropriate sharing of scientific data to be maximized, although that's left it still a little bit vague in my view about how to cash that out. Data from large-scale genomic studies to be broadly and responsibly shared. Research tools developed with NIH funding to be made accessible to other researchers. Unique model organisms to be made available to the scientific community. Clinical trials, as they're done, to be registered and the summary results reported in clinicaltrials.gov, and peer-reviewed manuscripts to all be put up on PubMed Central. So NIH is an example of a big push to try and get data sharing done. Again, a little bit short on the specifics, but sort of setting the expectation legally, morally, that researchers, when they are funded by the NIH, are going to do their best to be transparent, to share their findings, to make sure that their results are registered and stored. Many journals are calling for the storage of original data, and many authorities from professional societies the same. Still, there are big problems out there with respect to data sharing. It just isn't as common, as extensive as it ought to be, in my opinion. We're gaining knowledge, for example, just to give one instance, about rare diseases, but the ability to do things is sometimes limited by the scarcity and dispersity of patient data. So you've got a lot of information on a few patients, but many investigators are looking at diseases, trying to study those patients that they can get, but they're not sharing their information with others studying similar rare diseases. They're not homogenizing their surveys and templates and data storage techniques. And so while we get better understanding of these rare diseases, we're not getting what we should and probably what is needed to generate data that might lead to approvals of drugs or gene therapies. So, what are many of the problems? What do we have to do to encourage data sharing, which is a public good that I think science and biomedicine have to stand for, and is crucial to making sure that results are valid and warranted, other researchers being able to replicate, redo experiments to make sure that what is claimed is true. Without that ability, you just have basically long, somewhat peer-reviewed testimonials. In my opinion, the key to scientific validity is repetition of studies, the ability to repeat findings, and often you need transparency to be able to do that. So speed of research depends on sharing, maximizing the efficiency of funded research depends on sharing, and scientific reliability depends on sharing. So oftentimes, one problem is that we don't have common templates for storing data, for entering data. It's a Tower of Babel. You get many trials going on that aren't coordinated, that are very difficult to compare, particularly international work, but it can happen within a country as well. And this really hinders the ability to maximize a data set. So if we don't get agreement right from the get-go, when someone, say, does work on a disease like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell, or another condition that is common in many countries, that people are interested in. You're not going to be able to merge the data, do meta-analyses, if you will, extract out of those studies what you need to find to gain maximal power from the work. And this goes on and on and on, and everybody nods about doing something about it, but it doesn't happen. It may be that those patient groups who are involved in giving access to data sets may need to coordinate and say, if we're going to work with you, here's the template that you have to follow. It may require a third party, in other words, to impose more order upon data collection, registration, to ensure comparability than we're seeing and than we've seen in what is often a somewhat competitive environment between institutions and between investigators. Second problem is, to be blunt, commercialization. Tech transfer offices hinder data exchange. I don't know how many times in my own experience recently, somebody said to me, well, I've got the data and I'd like to get it out there, but my school or institution is demanding that they have a shot to patent or protect equity interests in whatever it is that we might be finding. So commercialization is really a factor that is hindering data exchange. And again, I hear many groups that have worked with researchers, patient advocacy groups with terrible diseases, and they're wondering why things aren't going faster in terms of getting the results out. And sometimes they're surprised and even shocked to learn that something is held up in a university or institute's tech transfer office. So we've got to come to grips with commercialization, find ways to let both people earn their money when they make a discovery or find a tool or do whatever they're going to do, and at the same time guarantee access to enough information that speed can be achieved without waiting for disputes over property or assurances of property interest to be established. And I think that's really one of the dark little secrets of data sharing, but there it is. I think that, well, the NIH, for example, points toward registering in clinicaltrials.gov, and that's great. If you visit that site, it is not maintained well. It is not updated rapidly. There's a lot of old old trials up there listed as open when they're not. Some people don't put negative findings up there because they don't think they have to, which is a huge mistake. We really need to power up clinicaltrials.gov if we're going to be talking seriously about data sharing. Investigators and journals sit on data and hinder data sharing. Many journals will say, can't share anything until it appears at least online and most likely in print. Again, I find that putting their interests ahead of the public interest, ahead of people who are looking for speed with respect to cures for themselves, their families, their children. There has to be a better way to make sure that data is rapidly shared around once a paper is accepted than waiting for it to get online or get into print. Now, we've had a number of efforts to sort of circumvent this during COVID by having rapid publication without peer review, but I don't favor that. Peer review is crucial to making sure that we have as sound a science as we can, even though the peer review system has many, many flaws and weaknesses. But just giving it up for server publication, I don't think is the way to go. We've got to find a better road whereby journals can still have their exclusives, make news, attract subscribers by being the place where things come out, and having access perhaps to researchers who are given permission to look at data prior to publication, but restricted maybe to those only who pass muster as having a legitimate research interest in wanting to see original data. There has to be a way to work that out. Ownership of data is still vague. Patients, academic institutions, funders, government agencies all lay claim to data. And it isn't clear sometimes who really owns and controls a data registry. I've had many patient groups complain to me that they want to sue investigators or institutions because they've sat on data for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. But it isn't clear that they can, because it isn't clear how ownership of data sets is established, or whether they built it into their initial agreements. But we need to be clear about who it is that owns data, partly to make sure that they are able to claim whatever commercial rewards are appropriate, but partly because of liability, to make sure that they move data out there. And we really need to work that area and improve it significantly. Ethics gets in the way sometimes of data sharing for two reasons. There are those who argue you can't really reuse data sets without explicit consent each time to the reuse, so-called specific consent. I find that not plausible, and I think ethicists, lawyers ought to be working to allow more broad permissions, more blanket consents, where people say, take the data set, use it for research, use it in whatever research you deem acceptable, researcher, to make new findings. You don't have to recontact me every time the data set gets touched. And I think that's especially so for a class of diseases. If I'm interested in muscular dystrophy, then I might restrict access to the data to all efforts to understand that disease. But it doesn't and shouldn't mean that we have to go back to each individual subject every time and get their permission for the next examination of a mutation or some mode of getting material into a cell to help and battle muscular dystrophy. Similarly, privacy. Privacy still remains a tough obstacle to data sharing. There are many who worry that people's identity will be revealed. IRBs, I think, have a role here to play, research ethics committees, in making sure that we set out protections for subjects, either insisting that things be anonymized, that when there are links to identifiable individuals, they're held by third parties, that no one can really break, if you will, the codes unless they have an absolutely good reason, like a new therapy has appeared or some powerful diagnostic test has appeared that people whose data was collected might well want to know about. But this idea that privacy is going to hinder access to data and therefore access to research and therefore access to cures, I think is simply not what patients want. If you ask them, do you want your privacy protected? Or would you like to see something done about spinal ataxia for your kid? I think I know which way the answers are going to go, and we have to drive policy in that direction. Lastly, I think there really are incentive problems for data sharing. It does require time and resources to get things set up to permit sharing. Sometimes there are language barriers, sometimes there are multiple research ethics committee or IRB approvals required. But for the most part, one of the biggest hindrances, I think, to data sharing is joint publication, multiple authorship, and hindrances to promotion and getting credit for the work that you're doing. And I think we've got to change our culture in academia, particularly to allow for promotion, to allow for advancement when people get involved in shared work and sharing data. It's a thing that if you want to see it, you have to reward it. If you don't reward it, and you only reward individualized, old-style R01 model, NIH model grants, you're not going to get as much data sharing. So in sum, I think there's a lot that can be done to really facilitate more data sharing. I appreciate the rhetoric. I appreciate people saying we need to do more. Hopefully, I've laid out a number of areas, a number of steps that might be taken to move things along more quickly. After all, that's what we owe our patients. At the end of the day, it's trying to advance cures, trying to reduce disability, trying to give earlier diagnoses, trying to give ideas about how to manage diseases and disorders. That's what the point is of collecting all this data. If we're not doing as well as we can be, then at least we can commit to doing better in a serious way. Thank you for watching.